and he walked with the children to the trains. He, very, very honorable man, one of my personal heroes. And
Okay, now we're ready to go.
that was 10 minutes.
It was not, but I just was fixing everything else on my end while the music played. The music is more a sleight of hand. Like I said in chat, we need a better producer because I'm the producer and should probably be fired. Um, Good evening, everyone. Thank you for showing up tonight. This is going to be the first night of a special 2-night episode because the topic at question is so large that we decided not to do a bad job because we don't want to be those guys. We want to make fun of those guys in our video essays because that apparently is really lucrative. Anyway, my name is Daedalus. I'm a military historian and Hetman, and tonight we're going to be talking about genocide. So,
And I am a specialist on genocide.
yes.
I wrote my MA dissertation on genocide, actually, specifically the Nazi occupation of Ukraine and Nazi policies towards the Slavic majority, so Ukrainians. How should we begin this? Discussing Lemkin's life and a little bit of like a background on him.
Yeah, that's probably best. A little bit of background on Lemkin, because he is kind of a central figure. And because when I started doing the research for the show, I was really, really surprised that prior to World War II, no one had decided to come up with a word for the mass
For mass
killing off of group of people. Like, it was
Yeah,
remarkable to me because we do that so very often in our
yeah,
history.
genocide had occurred by all means. Genocide had occurred well before Lemkin invented the term, and really, it is astounding and timely, somewhat. Actually, it's very timely how he came up with it, and I'm going to discuss it later as how the Shoah and the genocide of Roma and other peoples within the Holocaust is sort of the archetype of genocide, of the Article 2. So we'll discuss that a little bit.
Again, if
Um, for those who don't know, Lemkin, as we just mentioned, he's the inventor of the term genocide. He was he had his Juris Doctorate. I believe he received it in Lviv, if I'm not mistaken. He grew up he was born actually in what is now Western Belarus. It's in Rodinska Oblast. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Some Belarusians couldn't correct me, but Lemkin, of course, he's comes from the ethnic Jewish minority within the Russian Empire. He's keenly aware of social issues, and in the time that he grows up, that he comes of age, it's World War I and also the revolution and civil wars that follow. And when I say civil wars, these are sort of conflicts which take place in former Imperial Russian space. Not all of them. I mean, there's many different parties fighting in them, and not all of them are exactly the same to one another. But essentially, this is when he kind of grows up. Allegedly, his interest in human rights and specifically the topic of mass killing happens even in childhood. He's interested in, he was reading about Roman history and Nero feeding Christians to the lions, that incident. And also he was interested, of course, in contemporary events during his time growing up. So massacres which occurred in the Ottoman Empire, particularly the Armenian, what is now known as the Armenian genocide, was a big event which shaped his conception of genocide. But ultimately, where he gets sort of, I think, the what is in the articles, article 1, 2, 3, specifically 2 with, what is genocide. This is derived from Nazi policies in Europe.
which he wrote rather extensively about.
Yeah, he wrote a I believe, I don't know if you could call it a book. It's actually more of like a
It's
treatise
almost
or like
it's almost a philosophical track in a way.
it is. Yeah, it's Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, I believe the title is, and he outlines essentially what genocide is, within the framework of Nazi policies. Um, what's interesting too is he is pretty broad in that category, and actually we'll get more to it, but his conception of what his conception of genocide was a lot broader than what would actually be ratified in 1948, and he was actually rather disappointed by um, the limitations that world powers set on this. What I didn't know actually is that the United States didn't ratify, like they didn't actually I don't know if that's the right word or not.
No, it's not terribly uncommon for the United States to put in a front end of a lot of work in a UN document or treaty, and then the Senate to just simply not ratify it.
Yeah,
Um,
the same thing occurred after World War I with the League of Nations, if I'm not
yes, the same
mistaken.
thing occurs with pretty alarming regularity, depending on the whims of the Senate. They are very loath to put the United States in a position where it is giving up or appear to consider be giving up sovereign powers to the United Nations.
Yeah, and even to this day, we haven't ratified, I think, the International Criminal Court. So actually, and it's the same thing with Russia too. So theoretically, um, Russia, for a lot of the crimes that it's committing in Ukraine, individuals I know will be tried depending on, if they cross a border or not, but there's no way to extradite them. Um, and as long as they stay in Russia, they will live the rest of their lives, scot-free, regardless of what they've done. The same thing goes for, uh, other American war criminals, particularly those who might have committed excesses in Afghanistan or Iraq. Though, in comparison, I don't think you could really compare those two wars in terms of excesses.
So
Um,
if you've been here, and you might not have been here all month long because we've seen some pretty phenomenal growth this month, at least compared to the goals I set for us. Um, I have been doing a whole lot. I did on-stream research for
yeah,
this.
we kept the goals very minimal.
Yes, aim low, and you'll always trip over yourself. Uh, so I did some research into this because it's obviously a topical fact in a lot of ways right now. There is an ongoing discussion about China. There's an ongoing discussion about Ukraine. There are at least three separate ongoing discussions about the United States possibly committing genocide. Uh,
There's a big one too in regard to Myanmar, and they have a uh, Muslim population called the Rohingya, a ethnic
yes.
group that they're closely related to Bengals,
Uh,
as far as I know. And there's debate whether or not genocide has occurred there.
but what has struck me again and again, and something I want to get into as we examine this, is that genocide is a legal term ultimately. So
It
it,
is, and that's one of the most problematic aspects of it because
yes,
there are so many horrific crimes that human beings have committed against each other that are every bit, in terms of scale, scope, and viciousness, they're every bit as bad as genocide, but they fall short of that definition. It's actually very, very, I don't think people realize how difficult it is to get, for someone to be convicted of genocide and for, there to be a verdict of it, or even a charge of it. It's very, very difficult in terms of, in terms of international law, and many, many events have fallen short of it.
So I am moving our faces, and I am putting the convention up on the screen so we can read along.
Perfect.
And I'm moving the other thing. I actually took all the sources you gave me and stuck them here for quick reference tonight because
Perfect. I'm glad that someone read.
I'm uh, I've been doing an awful lot of work behind the scenes on this too. It's been a
Yeah.
long month, really. It has. Um,
I'm very proud of you for doing that, because it's never an easy topic to cover. I find genocide to be very, very grimly fascinating. Of course, it's something that draws me because, I dedicated a large portion of my academic life to it. But it is a very exhausting topic, and it's something that I think is inherent to human beings in general. Not genocide, the legal definition, but killing and just, the murderous nature of human beings. I think is it's something inherent within our species, and I don't think it's ever truly going to go away until we're all gone.
yeah, but it's it's a difficult topic, and I've also following a couple different wars right now, and all the general stuff I do for military history. So I'm the happy guy this month. But we should probably start, I think, with
There's
Article.
a genocide scholar who he wrote a book called, it was Hitler's Willing Executioners. It sort of examines the idea of the culpability of the average German in the Holocaust. And his argument essentially is that people knew they didn't do enough to prevent it, and your average German is culpable in the Holocaust. His work
Yeah,
is challenged by some other scholars who have a more nuanced approach. The reason why I bring him up is because we're talking about war, and one of his books, which really didn't get that much credit, and honestly, like, from an academic standpoint, I can't say it's like, if I were teaching a class on genocide, I wouldn't assign it. And it's not because it's necessarily methodologically extremely flawed, but he just, in general, he has a very black and white view of these events and sort of the motivations, how people go about perpetrating genocide. There's a wide typology of perpetration, and that's something too. I didn't really, when we were making, when we were planning for this episode, I didn't really put that section in there. There's a very good book, which is sort of seminal in regards to perpetrator studies, and it's Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, and it's a study of a German, I think it was an SS police unit that operated mainly in Eastern Poland, Western Belarus, and he examines the motivations of men, particularly um, peer pressure as a force in drawing people to commit these crimes. And one of the results of his study too is that in regards to the German case, if you didn't want to take part in it, you were completely free to do so. You could abstain from taking part in a massacre. For some of the allies of the Germans, especially in the East, so in my case, in my area of expertise, Ukrainians, um, sometimes Ukrainian police who would refuse to take part in a massacre actually fell victims to the Germans. They were either arrested, stripped of their guns, and then deported to forced labor, or they were actually shot along with the people that were being killed, usually Jews or communists or some other group. So it wasn't, the act of, no one's putting a gun to your head. Well, sometimes that is a factor,
I
but for the primary force, for the Germans, or say the Hungarians, Romanians, any of their allies in the East, they have the option to refrain from it. So his study is one that I really recommend. It's essential reading for anyone who studies genocide. And you should probably read Daniel Goldenhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners as well. But ultimately, I think Goldenhagen, the truth that he mentions is that genocide is a far worse endeavor than war, although it's often kind of
They usually go hand in
part of
hand.
war. They usually go hand in hand, but genocide has occurred outside of war. So it's
Yes.
not, they're not, how should we put it? They're not mutually exclusive things.
Well, one of the things I went into in the stream we did on Will and His channel's panel on transgenocide is that all the tools necessary to carry out a genocide exist within most modern states.
Yeah.
And the one day your friendly local police officer, who, let's be honest, is not necessarily always friendly or local, or your police officer, could next day be your executioner. So all of these tools exist. The capacity
And all,
exists within a state. So
it's
the
not, they're not,
line
yeah,
is tricky.
they're
And
not. Oh, go ahead. Keep going.
so
I got something to add to that.
in the terms of whether or not, and tomorrow we're going to be talking extensively about historical events that are understood to constitute genocide. And then we're also going to be talking about both nights. We're going to be talking about the framework itself, and whether this
Mhm.
framework is sufficient for our modern world, and whether it's even a useful thing. Um,
Mhm.
because I developed a very strong sense of feelings about this. I also did not know that German soldiers could exempt themselves. Um,
Yeah.
one of the
Oh,
things I one of the things I usually feel compelled to point out, because the Holocaust, because I do a lot of work with German history in the case of World War II, a lot of debunking especially, is I always feel compelled to point out that there was differentiation between who carried out the genocide in which occupied country. For example, out east, it was extensively carried out by the SS, but in France, it was administered by the Wehrmacht itself. So,
yeah.
like,
The Wehrmacht had a very large role, though, in the East as well. And in fact, it was instrumental in the areas that it governed. So, in Eastern Ukraine, this area was primarily controlled by the Wehrmacht and administered by the Wehrmacht. The SS, particularly the SD, so the intelligence arm of the Nazi Party, the SS, um, they operated hand in hand with Wehrmacht intelligence groups. So particularly with their Feldpolizei and then Geheime Feldpolizei, which are secret field police, and then just your regular field police, and then even regular units when they could not find the manpower. They would use even regular battle units to help carry out genocides, either to cordon off an area, and to even the shooting itself. So the Wehrmacht is complicit in genocide in the East as well. If you are talking about the Shoah, particularly, overwhelmingly, this is carried out by SS units, particularly SD. Um, but Wehrmacht units are responsible for it as well. And actually, there's sort of, we'll get into this when we cover Bosnia, particularly, but I would argue that there is sort of a joint criminal enterprise taking place in occupied Eastern Europe, all over it, really. But, in the
you're
area
talking
I
in
studied,
41, 42, 43, right?
41, 42, 43, and in the area that I studied, that joint criminal enterprise is the Hanved, the Hungarian army, the Wehrmacht, the local police organs. So this could be your rayon police that they set up. So a rayon is a county, which are made up of local individuals. Your forget what they were called actually, and I wrote about them. I forget the
I think
German
I
term
have
for
your
them.
paper on my hard drive somewhere. Um, uh,
But
when I
these
did the
there's a
corrections for
subgroup
the
of
military
police
stuff.
which are unarmed that help with it, primarily unarmed. Or I forget, they're not order police. It'll come to me. It's
Yeah,
actually
let's
it's extraordinary difficult sorting through the bureaucracy of Nazi Germany. Actually, the
trust me, I
Soviet
know.
Union is a lot more centralized in terms of its, organs, like its punitive organs. So you really don't have to know a whole lot. But with Nazi Germany, it's there's all sorts of different police units, all sorts of different groups perpetrating. But essentially, this joint criminal enterprise is led by the Germans. In my area, led by the Wehrmacht. At least they're doing most of the administrative work, and carried out on the ground by a mixture of SS, Wehrmacht, Hungarian soldiers. And actually, one thing that my research uncovered, although I don't think I actually put this on my master's paper, um, in the event that's has particularly importance to me because some of my own relatives died there. Um, the Hungarians were involved in that killing event. They were involved in taking the individuals from the area where they were at and then leading them to the killing site. And that was something that was, actually, there's a lot of people in Hungary, a lot of scholars, even my advisor, by the way, who believed that they didn't take part in these sort of actions. So,
Well,
yeah.
one of our mods is from Hungary, and one of our audience members is Hungarian this evening, and they are both very critical of the Hungarian education system from time to time. But before we get too far into whodunits, let's
Yeah.
go on to Article 2 of the
Yeah.
1948 Convention.
Okay. So,
In present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And this is the one that probably most important in my mind to most modern cases. D.
yeah.
Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Or E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This is at least part of Lemkin's framework that he
Can
describes.
I do something? Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Can I mention how? I mean, I don't even know if we really have to, but you can see how the Shoah, or if you want to call it Holocaust, if you want to include, of course, the I tend to, when I write about the Holocaust, I view it in a much broader sense. There are some scholars who use it to refer mainly to uh, the European Jewish population, but for me, it's a much broader category. It includes
It is in popular conception.
Poles, East Slav. Yeah.
I was reviewing
Um,
Stokesbury prior to. Um, I don't know if you remember reading Stokesbury in high school. In World War One, World War Two with
which
Mr.
book did you
Miller.
write?
Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I do remember it.
so he did a book. He actually did a couple books I really enjoy, but he did a book on World War Two. Um, he dedicates a couple extensive sections to the notion that the Holocaust was much larger than just the Jewish population. And he talks particularly at length about the
Mhm.
Polish population, and the manner in which Germany sought to use them and reduce them to what he used the phrase a helot race. uh,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Spartan conception of helots.
That was their plan for most of the, yeah,
Um, the
that
the other
you should
thing that
explain that because that's essentially,
yeah, I actually was doing another thing totally unrelated to this because sometimes I'm bad at research discipline. Actually, I'm very bad at research discipline some days. I was listening to a podcast from I'm not going to do his name properly. Um, he is he is best known for being the ditch guy. Um, he is the professor. He's a military history professor at uh, the United Kingdom's military academy, where he talks extensively about Spartan history. Um, so that was another thing I did this month, just to take my mind off of the other unhappy things I was doing. Anyway, the Spartans were not really that. They're not as they're homogeneously presented, but the Helots were individuals in Spartan society who existed functionally as slaves. They were a underclass that Sparta was so terrified of having them rise up and take control of the city that is the entire reason that the concept of the Spartan military existed was
yeah,
just in
yeah,
case
that is true.
their slaves rose up and overthrew them. So this was the concept that the German, or at least the Nazis, were um, getting at, was they wanted to take the people in the countries they conquered and weed out those, because they're eugenicists, obviously, because they got that bright idea from us, actually, here in America. They wanted to weed out the people who they thought were more capable intellectually, kill them right off, take the rest, and put them to work, and kill them off by getting labor out of them. So that was kind of the conception that they went into Poland with. Um, and they obviously killed an awful lot of people between Poland and the eventual farthest limit of advance they got in the USSR, which was a couple miles outside of Moscow.
I want to mention too that Article D, so preventing births within a group, the Nazis were, Nazi scientists particularly, were very, very adamant about trying to invent a way to sterilize women, either through injections or through like X-rays, like radiation. And they were trying to come up with various means to do this. So their intention, of using Poles and East Slavs, so Belarusians, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, actually, got to say that right. Um, their intention was eventually to have them die off gradually through this sterilization.
Uh,
So
that's actually D is really interesting in terms of methodology, I think, for causing a genocide, because it is a methodology that's incredibly common here in the United States as well. Women of
during
color,
the era of eugenics, it's common.
it's common today. We've had to reschedule several times. Um, and I'm going to nail down for February what was supposed to be January's special conversation. Um, but a lot of eugenics has been quietly incorporated into things like people getting sterilized in the prison system, women of color especially. Uh, it's been incorporated into trans issues now for some time too. Um, and that's also one of those things that has very much risen to the forefront of discussion here in the United States recently, is a concept of a trans genocide. Uh, the problem that people have been having in this particular discussion, and Lemkin had a weird take on African Americans at the time too. But the problem that people have had that is that the article in whole does not make enough differentiations between who may be the subject of genocide, I think. And that people, when they try to define what a genocide, when a genocide is happening, cleave entirely too close to the national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups and do not separate other social groups that might be subject to those behaviors.
Of course, if you included social groups within the definition, Nazi Germany's genocide would be a lot broader than it even was. It would include, of course, homosexuals or sexually divergent people.
But it
It would
was those
include,
were included in the Holocaust. They were included in the
yeah, they were,
camps.
yeah. But if you were to put that in court, international criminal court, and try, to use the genocide convention would not apply to it. And that's, where it falls short. One example where it falls short. And the ironic aspect of that is the killing of sexually divergent people, and mentally handicapped people, all of the people who were killed within the Nazi T4 program.
Right.
Um, Essentially, that is what, forget the author who wrote it. He wrote a book called KL. It's a history of the German concentration camp system. He's a German historian and a very good one. That's a book I would recommend. But his argument is essentially that these programs, these Nazi eugenic programs, were a means of like sort of wiping the racial slate clean. So getting rid of all of the weaknesses and impurities within the German racial body.
Yes. The other so and this gets into something
So
chats. This is
I
getting
just mentioned
something.
one thing. That in itself is such a very genocidal concept. It brings within that category uh, ethnicity and race, at least in my opinion.
Yes.
Although it is the titular group committing, crimes against German citizens, the vast majority of whom, the people, homosexuals in Germany who were killed, um, of mentally handicapped and physically handicapped people are themselves, they're Germans.
Well, yes.
So yeah,
The other thing, and chat is getting into this too, is this is the problem with setting this up as a matter of law.
yeah,
Law putting someone on trial is a problem because by the time you have them on trial, the thing has already happened, which is not terribly useful in terms of stopping the thing because the law is no proof of deterrence against committing a crime. The international law, especially because it is so difficult to enforce, is especially not useful in deterring crime. So by the
there's
time we're here, the people who need help are gone.
yeah,
Uh,
there's a whole, there's within genocide studies, there's a whole debate, very big polemic about prevention and intervention. And that's something that we need to talk about. It might even deserve a whole episode on its own, separate from the two that we're doing. There are divergent streams of thought in regards to um, prevention and intervention. And there were many interventions that were carried out very poorly and went awry.
well, the problem with
Yeah,
intervening either prior or during is a very difficult thing to do. Um, because oftentimes, because like we were saying earlier, because it is connected to usually a military conflict, you
hmm,
are situating yourself between either an army and a mostly defenseless group, which is kind of tricky for a lot of reasons. Or you are situating yourself between two opposing militaries, which is even worse. Uh, like recognition of the fact that interactions between soldiers and civilians on the battlefield is fraught and upon which a lot of modern conflict hinges really came into effect for America around 2009, 2010, when they started doing a lot more civilians on the battlefield training. For example, I went through civilians in the battlefield training as an officer cadet. Not that it was particularly germane to the exercises that we were doing as part of our evaluations, but because it was considered to be so essential that you get the right kind of people in the right mindset ahead of time that they wanted to start it early. So intervention is just a kind of massive topic and not
This really requires a very in-depth episode. And in particular, I think we can go over the events that occurred in the 1990s. There's at least 4 that I can think of on the top of my mind. We're going to go over some in the
tomorrow.
course of
I
these
have
2
Rwanda down and
episodes.
Bosnia down for sure.
Yeah, but
Somalia can probably be included too.
Somalia was what I was going to include as well. And also, it didn't have this, but it was, there was a lot of debate around it, was the Darfur
Yes,
genocide. Yeah.
the solution to which was mind-boggling to me, but that's for tomorrow. Um,
Yeah.
so Article 2 outlines these groups, which are not, I don't think are sufficient for our present cause. But more important, I think, is it outlines the mechanisms by which you commit genocide. Not you in particular, but you know what I mean. Um, do you think that
Yeah.
these subsections, do you think that anything has been excluded in this? Any action has been excluded from Article 2 that should be included as a means by which a group can commit genocide?
So Lemkin had this idea of what is called cultural genocide. So essentially destroying a group by forcibly assimilating them, destroying their artifacts, destroying their heritage. And this was exempted because, for several reasons, it was challenged. It was challenged in 1948 by both the United States and the Soviet Union. And the United States, in particular, in regard to the history with slavery and also Native American history, with this aspect added on, would have definitely been guilty of genocide. Some other people do argue, and I would argue, at least in the case of Native Americans, that genocide, um, it's very complicated when you're dealing with sort of these colonial eras, especially at a time where, you know, unless you look at sort of isolated incidents, it's very hard to try these things retroactively. But when you see a population like, the Native American or Native Canadian populations, you can obviously see that they're victims of genocide.
Well, there,
Especially in regards to their culture being wiped out, a large part of the group being wiped out. But the thing is their demise happened over the course of maybe 200, 300 years. If we're talking
about
about the
400 actually. If
indigenous,
you
yeah,
think about
400. If you're talking
colonial
about the
history, it's
yeah, if
about
you're talking
400
about the
years in the
entire,
North American continent and South
yeah,
America.
yeah, that's that too. So it's very difficult to try this retroactively. And what we'll get into is intent. Murderous intent matters a lot, and proof of this intent matters a lot in terms of reaching a genocide verdict, and even um, trying for someone for genocide. You have to have the burden of proof, so to speak. But this is a tricky subject as well, because a lot of people who are doing such acts, human beings, even murderers, they know what they're doing is wrong. Hitler deep down knew what he was doing, sort of defied conventions of morality. Hitler didn't really have, a Judeo-Christian conception of morality. I
I'm
say
not
that
sure
for
about
all
that
positive.
actually. I don't know.
This
Have
is
you
a
ever
whole
read
debate we
have you
can
ever
get
read
into.
Mein Kampf?
I have, yeah, but you
See,
know,
he alludes to this Christian concept so much that it's either an affect he put on to appear acceptable, or he actually believes it. Um, Mein Kampf for the
argue that
audience.
it's the former, because you can find within his conversations, quotes, and within the quotes of many of his inner elites. So people like Alfred Rosenberg, they viewed Christianity, um, Judeo-Christianity in particular, as being a religion of the weak, and it being a limiting factor. Um, their idea was their philosophy, their worldview, National Socialist worldview, is very social Darwinian. Um, and Christianity, although, we're getting into history here, in terms of like colonial history, and there's no doubt, the Catholic Church has been part of genocidal events, and it even was to a degree, at least the Catholic Church in Germany, to a degree compliant in the Holocaust. But it was also, this is a whole another debate, is, Hitler and Christianity. And that's something that I don't know if you've heard of Richard Carrier. He's kind of like this famous popular historian. My buddy is thinking about getting me to debate him on this topic. And I'm not going there as a Christian, even though I am. Um, Spoiler. But I am going there as a historian, sort of on the opposite end of his debate.
So yeah,
But anyway, yeah. Um, where were we at before we
we are
diverged?
on part F, the erasure of culture. So
Yeah,
here is, and we're talking about intent. And so you talked specifically about North America and South America as
correct.
examples of this. I think so one of the things I sort of observe on a meta level about colonial history is that, especially like you get Africa and the scramble for Africa and the cases, a lot of these cases for these countries,
Uh, yeah,
is there is an overriding desire by the colonial power to make to subjugate the way that these colonized peoples interact with them.
yeah,
Instead of interacting with the colonial power in the manner that the colonized power recognizes, they try to get the colonized power to interact with them in a way that's amenable to the colonizing state's system.
mhm, of
And that by necessity erases culture.
course
So the problem with intent is a very legal thing.
it
Um,
is. Do
and
you think? Can I ask something?
sure,
Do you think that, say, in we're talking about colonial history broadly, and that's, you know this is a very large portion of history, but let's just say,
yeah, we didn't come with specific examples for that.
yeah, the pre-Victorian era and the Victorian era. So say we're talking about, um, King Leopold's Congo. So like, the
King
very
Leopold
massive,
the Second of
massive,
Belgium.
yeah, the very massive atrocities which occurred in this region, which, um, by some degree, fall short of the legal definition. But do you think that the people, that what they're doing to these people, that they fail not to see this? What I see, and you see this same sort of tendency with the Germans during the Holocaust. You see it with the Soviets for sure during collectivization and during, even with the Gulag system. Um, the main goal is to extract natural resources and basically use the local population at their own expense to do that. and to get riches from it. Do they know what they're doing? I mean, in terms of killing off these people, because there are some genocides, you know, and which are a lot more clear cut. Of course, the Holocaust, they kill people through labor. They kill, the primary victim, of the Shoah, of Jews, the European Jewry through labor to extract, as much labor from them as they can to make use out of them. But do you think that there is the same intent there in regards to these colonial genocides? I believe that there is, but I don't really think that they're going about this just to kill them. Killing them is a byproduct of of the overall sort of goal that they have. It's not their primary goal.
So answer in two parts here, because colonialism creates a result of genocide in a lot of cases. In fact, most cases I can think of off the top of my head, colonialism resulted in a lot of mass death.
Yeah.
There are exceptions. So many cases, you see these cases where people are exploiting a population, exploiting the resources the population is sitting on, and you get a genocide, or for our legal definition, you get a genocide-like state. But at the same time, you have cases where there are groups that are, even today, like Native Americans, still experience a considerable amount of death that's largely unnecessary because of the inequities forced on them from the reservation system. And that's not exploiting a resource anymore. That's maintaining a status quo. You see this case of a higher rate of incidence of suicide than the general population for LGBTQ people who are harassed in some states under the law, and that's about maintaining a status quo. That's not about extracting value from them.
Of course, yeah.
And
I would argue too that maintaining the status quo is it's a very large fixture of these colonial regimes. And I think too, it's beneficial that mass death occurs during this period because it pacifies the population. It also, there's a lot of divide and conquer going on in every case of genocide, of these sort of colonial genocides. I would say too, in regard to, like say King Leopold's Congo, you have a group called the Force Publique. They're basically the indigenous policemen and military force, which the rubber companies use to enforce these, forced labor. And they commit horrible atrocities. These people too are largely, they themselves, even though they are an instrument of genocide, they are also a victim. And I wrote a recent, I didn't write an article on it yet. I plan on doing it, but I did a presentation on it, and I argued that Ukrainian auxiliary policemen were in large part a German force publique. They themselves were also victims in some way, even though they are perpetrators. These two categories are not mutually exclusive by any means. They overlap. They overlap too with the Judenrat. This is the Jewish ghetto police or administration. So you have the case, for example, of the Łódź, the Lodz ghetto. Some people call it Lodz. It's actually Łódź in Polish. And this was a highly productive industrial area in pre-war Poland, and it still is actually. I think it's kind of post-industrial now, and it's kind of a growing tech city. But one of the main enforcers of terror in the Łódź ghetto was a man named Chaim Urunkowski, and he was basically the Burgomeister, the head of the Jewish ghetto and the head of the Judenrat. And he played an active role in deportations, in the beating of people, in killings. He himself was eventually deported as well. There's some anecdotal evidence that he was actually he never reached the camps, that some of the prisoners killed him himself. And there were a lot of people who had a lot of reason to hate him because he did some very heinous things. He
So
deported children, and he also used his position to sexually violate young women and girls within the ghetto. So there are such people, and I would argue that many of the police forces in the occupied Soviet territories in Poland, for sure, not as much with the Baltic territories. The Baltic peoples, the Germans had a lot more vague racial conceptions of the Baltic peoples, and they were in general less hostile towards them. But for example, I can give you the example from my own research. So, and this is, like, I think I had the case files of maybe 40 policemen or people associated with the collaborative administration within the area of the Ukraine I studied. At least 10, maybe 15, I forget the actual number of these people, ended up becoming victims of the Nazi punitive system. One of whom, a man who was, responsible a large part for the Holocaust in the town that I studied, and also the murder of activists, like communist activists, their family members, anyone who opposed, the Nazi regime within the town. His name was Vasil Davydenko, and he was later arrested by the Germans in February of 1943, and he was shot. He was shot in the very same site where he was shooting people or helping shoot people.
well, that's convenient.
So, and he was shot. We don't really know we don't have a clear reason why he was shot. Some allege that he had passed information to Soviet underground, which is possible. But given his social background, I looked into his social background, and I actually became friends with the wife of his grandson. She's a friend of mine, which is, astounding because this guy helped kill some of my own family. But the most clear, like the example that was given by one person who was fairly close to Vasil Davydenko was that he was a alcoholic, and the Germans had a special informant system that they recruited among the populace. It was very easy, by the way, for the Germans to, when they went into the Soviet Union, to utilize Stalinist punitive structures that were already there. So the culture of informing on people was already there under Stalinism. So that was very easy to exploit. And they set up their own sort of special informant system. And when Vasil Davydenko was drunk, he happened to have a conversation with someone about this. And that was enough to get him killed. And he was lucky because they didn't kill his family with him, and I wouldn't know Valentina. Too bad this isn't in Ukrainian. She would probably like to hear it. Yeah, so that's like, another example is that these two things of, these two concepts of perpetrator and victim, they are not mutually exclusive at all. And this applies to almost all genocides.
So we have a question from the audience, and I'm getting some clarification in case I got it wrong. Grammar Kami is asking about, I believe, your first example. Is that the guy who is famous for the "Give Me Your Children" speech? Which
Yes,
honestly sounds
that's
like
Raimundo.
yes, which
Yeah,
honestly
that's
sounds like
Raimundo.
something that Lev Beria would have said. He's
You
another
gotta
one.
watch. You can watch. There's a whole documentary, and they have a actor orate that speech, and it's chilling. The Nazis essentially and these are the people who kind of argue for Chaim Rumkowski that he, was just trying to buy time and save people's lives. But, you can bet and actually be sure of probably that the people closest to them, they didn't have to give their kids. So yeah, this was, when the Germans were requesting, they started to transport people from the Łódź ghetto. And he gave that speech about, I'm sorry, but you have to give up your children. And I tried, but I've been keeping us alive, and I've kept us alive thus far. But he was full of shit. I really do hope that Chaim Rumkowski fell victim to some of the other residents of the ghetto. I hope that they were the ones.
We're gonna call for YouTube's terms of service any reference to violence a kinetic solution. I'm going to borrow.
Rumkowski's been dead for.
Yes, but the YouTube moderators are not dead. They can still get us.
Yeah, it would be ironic, wouldn't it? Okay.
At any rate, so we're going to move quickly on to Article 3. I'm going to read that, and we're going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about the other bullet point on the sheet.
That's the Rome Statute and war crimes, right?
Yes. Article 3, the following acts shall be punishable: genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, complicity in genocide. Actually, I don't have too many problems with Article 3 as far as
yeah, it covers it pretty well, doesn't it?
As far as a legal framework, it works out really, really well.
Yeah.
But again, you run into the same particular problem. Yanis Korzak. I am not Lucy. I probably did that wrong. Janusz
Korczak?
Yes.
Janusz Korczak. Yeah, he so he was a Polish Jew. He was very sort of influential in all of Europe in terms of child psychology and how you should, discipline children. And it's largely a reason why in many of the more civilized countries in Europe, they don't really hit their kids. It's funny, my Polish friend Wojciech said that, because of Janusz Korczak, that Poles don't hit their kids. And I definitely, I don't know how he could say that being from that country, because that's absolute BS. But yeah, Janusz Korczak was even offered by some Nazis. They knew of his work, and they said, "We will let you out. We don't want to kill you." And he walked with the children to the trains. He very, very honorable man. One of my personal heroes, and yeah, it almost brings tears to my eyes, honestly, his case.
Okay, now I get what Lucy's striving
at. We have a small following, but they know their history pretty well.
That was the point. That's why I've been parasitically leeching an audience off of President Sunday for 3 months, and will continue to do so.
Good.
Any rate, no, Article 3, again, it covers everything pretty well, but again, the stable door's already open. The horse is gone. He is from America, just like me. Me and Hetman went to high school together. We've been having these discussions now for close to 15 years. Now we just decided to make a thing of it.
I am from America, but I am the most
not American you'll ever meet.
Just not American, but I'm like the most. There's a reason why I call myself Hetman. So it's because in spirit I'm a Kozak, and in a lot of the negative ways too. But we're not going to get into that. Maybe on some debate that we have on this channel, you'll get to see that side. But yeah,
I don't know. I
I'm
think I'm
really,
delightful and pretty agreeable. I didn't used to be delightful and agreeable. However, I am much more delightful and agreeable now.
that comes with age, and it's come with me too over the years. I
Uh,
found that I softened a great deal. But anyway, back to the topic at hand. Let's talk about what genocide isn't in the other legal categories in terms of international crimes. Um, so the one that is, more obvious and, sort of, you know, I think in regards to today, if we're talking about, the conflict in Ukraine, it applies to a larger degree, is of course war crimes. And I think I will leave that to you, given that,
so war
you have
crimes is a
what constitutes a war crime legally?
hang on. Dog is moving. I don't know why. Um oh, you want uppies? Is it uppies time? Hang on. Woo! Ah, Avery is not a war crime.
It's so cute.
So war crimes are defined, at least internationally, by the Geneva Conventions, and they are crimes carried out, their actions carried out by military units against a country or a military during times of war.
Yeah. So
Um,
these cover both civilians and military.
yes, the problem. So there are a couple
They,
legal problems again with the Geneva Conventions that are largely similar to the Convention on Genocide.
they don't cover irregulars. Actually, that's one
They
major
do.
issue.
They do. Um,
Not a lot of people follow that.
yes. So here's the point about the Geneva Conventions: is they apply to anyone who is a signatory of the Geneva Conventions, and they apply to anyone who acts in accordance with the Geneva Convention. So suppose for a moment that the United States is fighting against an insurgent force in some Middle Eastern country. Should those insurgents abide by the code set out by the Geneva Convention, they would be entitled to be treated as enemy combatants instead of uh, terrorists. That's probably not the right term in this particular case, but you get what I'm driving at.
Yeah.
So, like taking Ukraine as an example, it is absolutely a war crime what was found in the wake of the retreat from Kiev, or the
Yeah.
Russian
From
retreat from Kiev
Bucha,
at
yeah,
Bucha.
from
Yes,
Izium,
um,
around Kharkiv region from Izium.
it is almost certainly a war crime. The indiscriminate attacks upon civilian infrastructure, or more
Oh, without a
specific,
doubt.
with not necessarily the infrastructure itself, the attacks on occupied buildings.
Yeah.
I can see a legitimate military purpose in the destruction of the power grid, for example. That it causes civilian deaths is bad, but not necessarily a criminal act.
And that's something we did in 2003 in Iraq.
That is something we have done ever since we've been able to put bombs and things and throw them at
Yeah.
people. Um,
That, among other things, but that was a big cause. Like that is a big reason why the insurgency occurred, was the lack of restoration quick enough of that infrastructure. And
did you,
that, and of
by
course,
any
firing.
chance, watch Generation Kill?
I watched it a very long time ago when it was on HBO. I haven't rewatched it. I really should.
Uh,
I remember it being very, very excellent.
so that was not my first exposure to that story, actually. The first exposure, my dad got me a book when I was still thinking about going to the Marines as opposed to the Army, called One Bullet Away by Nate Fick, who is the
Sure that.
officer who is the subject of the platoon in Generation Kill. He talked extensively about the period between this capture of Baghdad and when he left, which wasn't that long, honestly, where they didn't take steps to restore order, and they did not provide uh, they did not provide services, and that helped turn the population against them.
You know what's very ironic in that, I look at some of the like American colonial wars in the early 20th century, late 19th century in Latin America, and particularly like with the invasion of the Dominican Republic or like Haiti, things like this. It seems that the US military was very good at restoring order. I mean, actually using force to do it, but, getting things under control, so to speak. I know in the Philippines, it's a slightly different story. And actually, there's some very, very horrible atrocities which occurred in the American Philippine insurgency, um, which are, beyond the scope of, unfortunately, beyond the scope of this topic because we didn't make a section for them. But that's what kind of astounds me is, we do have a fairly, you know, decent history of combating insurgencies. And, for whatever reason, this was forgotten in the Vietnam conflict.
This kind of
But
is
that's a whole, yeah.
different topic. What I will say is it's a lot. It's not the same. There's none of those particular situations had great outcomes for the population involved, especially, really principally. B, there is not a oh, that's why he's getting excited. Cats are being fed. There is not the framework for coin counterinsurgency operations doesn't scale well. So it's one thing to go into Haiti, it's entirely another to go into Iraq. This would be an even bigger issue for Russia and Ukraine, and I don't even think it's accomplishable at that scale.
No, it's not.
Yes, you're a good bubba. You are. Good bubba.
We should get into the topic of the Rome Statute and crimes against humanity, because that's where you have almost, total overlap with genocide.
Yes.
But genocide is less inclusive. And actually, the French legal scholars are quite opposed to genocide as a definition because crimes against humanity cover most of it within crimes against humanity. So the difference between war crimes and crimes against humanity is crimes against humanity, they can occur outside of war. They can involve, a wide variety of groups, not just religious, ethnical, and racial groups, but also, that includes, they include, I think, sexual, like deviant groups, like sexual deviant, divergent, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, your conservative is showing tonight.
I am not that conservative.
No, you're not. I'm just giving you a really hard time.
Yeah.
Because my
Yeah.
capitalism is my leftism is threatening to come out pretty quick too.
Yeah, but anyway, it's a lot more broader of a category. It includes political groups, as far as I know. And
it generally applies to human beings.
Yeah,
really,
it applies to human beings, but it crimes against humanity.
it doesn't apply
You
so
know
much.
how in words it doesn't have that weight.
Yes,
It just doesn't. Even though that in itself sounds heavy, and it is very heavy, but it doesn't have the weight of genocide. And genocide, it's one of those words that has existed for 1948. I don't do math that well. So around, it's approaching, 75, 80 years. And you hear it so often. You hear it used in such inappropriate ways too, but it has entered linguistic parlance in all, world languages. People know what it is. I can say it in Russian and Ukrainian, genocide, genocide. So it's, it exists, and it has weight. and nobody, wants to accept the horrible thing that happened to their group as anything less than genocide. And it's kind of like, that
You'd be surprised,
term,
actually.
yeah, that term, crimes against humanity, it's kind of like, something, it has been used legally. I think it has been used on the international stage, but, it just doesn't, even though it fits, it is that all-inclusive category, it just doesn't. And that's why I think, I agree with you, and we'll talk more about ways in which, these the article should be amended, I believe. And thing,
Trans
that's
genocide
something
is
that I have
real.
a bit of a divergent view. No offense to anyone, any trans men, women, or gender fluid people on here, but yeah, I mean,
I mean, till the cows come home. And it probably should be amended.
your your connection's a little.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of packet loss, actually. Um, we could amend this document until the cows come home. The problem is has no mechanism of enforcement. A genocide is probably best prevented rather
It
than.
has the International Criminal Court. Yeah, no. And then that gets into the whole debate of prevention, which is a whole another can of worms.
Hang on,
Should we start to? Go ahead.
I gotta put the dog down. And good jump, Bubba. I gotta fix this because I think we're about to lose the audience. Boop, 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 boop. Settings.
You mean in
Stream.
terms of our connection?
Yeah, I'm seeing packet loss. Let's just drop this
We're not
down.
losing it because of what I said.
No, the thing isn't. My internet connection's bad. We're getting sometime this year we'll be. No, sometime this year we're getting fiber. I got the notification.
I have fiber.
Yeah, I got the notification
in my new apartment.
On my garage.
What fiber are you getting? Full fiber, or are you getting AT&T?
The town is putting in its own fiber network.
Okay.
Because we like to spend money weirdly out here in Colorado.
I mean,
yeah, it's picked up coming.
There are way worse ways to spend the money, but should we talk about some of the examples of genocide in history? Should we get into that, or is that for tomorrow's discussion?
That is absolutely for tomorrow to make sure I can fill out 2 episodes. Remember, I'm the producer and I should be fired.
It's a learning curve.
So objections during the convention by the United States and the Soviet Union. Which is something you want to talk about.
The Soviet Union had objections to political groups. And Lemkin was a very harsh critic of the Soviet Union. He absolutely, and I mean, for good reason, but he was also very much influenced by a lot of the diaspora groups. And Lemkin is actually, he's sort of the first proponent. He outlined sort of a concept of how the Soviet Union, and I think even to a greater degree, like Russian imperialism, from the imperial era, have been committing a long genocide against the Ukrainian people. And he argues some very good points with that. There's one scholar who I don't really care for him. The main reason why I'm not going to mention his name. The main reason why I don't care for him, I might have to mention his name just so people, we can provide, for our viewers, we can provide some links later. I don't particularly not a lot of people like him within the Ukrainian studies community. So I don't think I would be blacklisted if I were to, talk anything bad about him, because he's got a tendency sort of to bully young scholars. And he hasn't really done a whole lot of actual research. He just kind of bullies people online. And he's an older man from
Hey,
the Ukrainian,
that's
Western
my
Ukrainian
job.
diaspora. Yeah, I mean, he's been doing this for a much longer time than you, but he does, every once in a while, some guy like this gets something right. And this will be more, we'll talk more about it tomorrow. I argue that we should have 3 episodes, honestly. So maybe we'll talk about that when we're done. But I think tomorrow should be talking about actual convictions of genocide, actual sort of known cases, and then we'll touch upon the cases that have been debated. And here's a case that is debated, is of course the Soviet genocide in the Ukrainian SSSR, the Holodomor, the hunger famine, the genocide by famine, which occurred during and after collectivization. And this is a whole topic that could have its several episodes, really.
Causing
Several
serious
episodes.
bodily or mental harm to members of a group. I don't know if you want to make an entire country hangry, if that's a great plan. Deliberately inflicting on the group
Yeah,
conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole
yeah,
or in part. I would argue
yeah.
that, yes, that is a genocide, but we'll get into that tomorrow.
Yeah, we'll get into the nuances of the debate. I would classify it as one too. Um, I think though that its characteristics are a lot different. And one issue with it is that researchers for a very long time, up until recently, when you actually have people looking at, the topic of perpetration, looking at, sort of building a social history of the famines that, took place in Ukraine, and then this other southern republics of the Soviet Union. There's also the Kazakhstan famine, which definitely falls into this whole category as well. We'll get into that probably at some point. But yeah, now there's a lot more scholarship on it, but essentially people tried to frame it. It's kind of like the Western Ukrainian diaspora's way of sort of kind of like, and it isn't, I'm not going to frame it in this way because it's not the case. It's a huge event, a huge crime, and as I would say, genocide against the Ukrainian people. It's embedded within the memory of the people who survived it. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing several survivors, and I've had the pleasure of knowing many, many people whose family survived it, and many of them who didn't. But before it was sort of put in the framework of other genocides, sort of like, a Holocaust framework, of the Holocaust historiography. And the thing is that this event is fundamentally different. Every genocide is different from one another. They are all, they all fit, they're all within that definition, but every mass killing, every genocide has its own unique characteristics. And the Holodomor is a very different one than the Nazi genocide.
You
And
could
it's
not.
also one of the ones where the burden of intent is where, that's the difficulty, in terms of when you look at the higher ups, in the Soviet Union, particularly Stalin.
You could not have segued better to my next thing that I wanted to talk about.
What is it?
Every genocide is different.
Yeah.
Contains with it. So there is
Everyone is, and here's another thing I want to mention is that I like comparative study, but I never like to, say which one is worse, because ultimately, if you're a victim who was killed in something,
this
I mean,
sucks. Yeah, but mine
yeah,
sucks worse than yours.
of course, and it's really, even in terms of, people get into numbers and things like this, like I equally wouldn't want to be in a gas chamber. I wouldn't want to be in like a gas chamber in Auschwitz. I also wouldn't want to be having my throat slit over a bridge on the Drina River during the Bosnian Serb army ethnic cleansings, which some people argue, they fit into the greater framework of a larger genocide. So I mean, like, yeah, those two events are equally horrible, and to say one's worse than the other is just
Not
there's no way you
useful.
can do that.
It's
I
also
mean,
it's also incredibly crass as both a personal and a general practice.
I had a very uneducated Ukrainian woman, and not from, I mean, she was from Ukraine, a far right woman, by the way, telling me about how much worse, like, um, telling me of all people, and I've written about the Holodomor, I've written about the Holocaust, the greater Holocaust, where actually my whole topic was on Ukrainian victims of Nazi Germany. So, she was trying to write, like, I hate to say it because I have some right views as well, but like she was trying to like she's one of those people where like, yeah, I write internet memes, I don't actually look at, I don't go into archives. So,
Well, in
she tried to
fairness,
explain the Holodomor to me, which was just laughable. Um,
after the Russians blew it up, you aren't going into archives either. Um, which
there's other
aside,
archives I can go into, and I already kind of have plans to go into some other ones. My main archive was blown up. I don't want people to know exactly who I am on this channel, but
don't worry about it.
that's
That's what the names are for. Uh,
that's all I can say is that the archive in which I did most of my research, unfortunately, some people decided that that building was a promising target, and some other people decided that those documents weren't valuable enough to, they didn't have the foresight to evacuate them. And yeah, luckily though, my colleague saved a lot of these documents, not nearly the amount that were there, and it's a huge tragedy. It's been almost up there with like the death of my grandfather, the death of like the untimely death of my mom's sister. It's been up there. I think it's probably in some ways worse than those two events, like, in some aspects for me,
it,
which is saying a lot, but yeah, it's been horrible. Um, but yeah,
at any rate,
that's something I do want to place emphasis on though, is that when we talk in this channel, we're not getting into those debates over quantity, over quality, or anything like this. Genocide is horrible. Mass killing is horrible, no matter if it's 50 people versus 5 million. So we need to look at it as what it is and treat it that way. I think maybe we can close with that, unless there's something else you want to
there's
bring up.
actually one more fairly big document that comes up in this discourse that I wanted to talk about, and then
Please,
we'll
let's
do
do
the
it.
closing. The last one I wanted to talk about was the 10 stages of genocide that
Oh,
is
wow.
used by the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust to kind of explain the process.
Mhm.
Um, it came up particularly. It came up particularly in the stream I covered earlier this month. This has been a long month. I can't believe I did that stream this month. Ugh.
You're a workhorse, man.
Anyway,
I'll try to pull a little bit more of my weight. I'm busy.
we got to do some
Work.
schedule work because I don't have a
Yeah.
proper schedule set up for Friday or for February because as we've established several times throughout this show, I am the producer and I should be fired.
Yeah.
Anyway, the
So actually, you're going to be the one to have to cover this because
it's very much a popular
on me, but
document as
I
opposed to an
actually,
academic one. It is very
yeah,
much a popular document as opposed to an academic one.
yeah.
So
Was it USHMM that did this, the United States Memorial Holocaust Museum?
no, Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, who I believe funds a organization in the
We
United
probably are,
Kingdom.
yeah, funding organization for them.
They have Gregory H. Stanton, president of Genocide Watch, developed the 10 stages of genocide to explain the different stages which lead to genocide. These stages are classification. The differences between people are not respected. There's a vision of us and them, which can be carried out using different stereotypes or excluding people who are perceived to be different, which we talked about today. Symbolization. There is a visual manifestation of hatred. Jews in Nazi Europe were forced to wear yellow stars to show that they were different. Discrimination. The dominant group denies civil rights or even citizenship to identify groups. The 1935 Nuremberg laws stripped the Jews of their German citizenship, made it illegal for them to do many jobs or marry not German non-Jews. Dehumanization. Those perceived as different are treated with no form of human rights or personal dignity. During the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, the Tutsis were referred to as cockroaches. The Nazis referred to Jews as vermin. And when we talk about the trans genocide tomorrow, this is going to come in a huge play when I make some comparisons that
Yeah,
might make you
that
very upset.
dehumanization is used a lot. It's a lot more common within society even now than than it's ever present. It's something that is there. One thing that I want to touch on that you mentioned, you were talking about tools of genocide being
Yes.
present in society. I want to mention conditions and fault lines that exist within societies. And I would argue that within our country, within the United States, that those fault lines certainly exist.
So I was
In
actually
those
having this as
conditions.
another broad conversation with someone while I was talking about Russia, and more specifically Russia in 2016. Um,
Mhm.
and uh, there is a concept that has become very big in military theory in the last couple of years. Uh, David Kinkellan wrote a paper to try to explain a phenomenon that's pretty old, actually, called liminal warfare. Um, so, for example, uh, two big examples step out: the formation of the LNR and DNR in Ukraine by the FSB is an effort to wage war indirectly and cause and exploit fault lines in a population to
Of course.
cause an less obvious though would be, for example, Russia's efforts to help Donald Trump in the 2016 election, or their efforts to assist the Leave movement in the United Kingdom in
Yeah.
2016. They're trying to exploit fault lines and weaken a enemy nation's ability to cooperate with one another. That they
Yeah.
succeeded in two cases is probably accidental. Uh,
That's actually, I mean, the Soviet Union has a long history of doing that with both their internal republics and client states.
yes.
Um, the Russian Empire has done that as well. It's sort of, I mean, it's essentially like a divide and conquer strategy, and that's something that isn't limited to Russia. I could argue too, and I'm not actually. I don't want to. I just want to make this clear. I am not advocating on the side of Russia, especially its current, especially modern day Russia. Um, but I could argue that the United States has pursued very similar policies um, in Central America and Southeast Asia, um,
Middle East,
Middle East. Yeah, so
Harlem.
these are not something that that is unique to the FSB or Russia. And actually, I will be absolutely honest. I don't think that the FSB, I mean, this is a whole different debate, had to do a whole lot. And I don't really think, having seen how badly they screwed up Ukraine and how bad,
The degree to
there's been
which
no
it's the FSB by itself or it's the GRU is debatable. The
yeah,
mechanism, though, the mechanism by which they acted was social media, which is a entirely different
Social media is a very big tool. It could be a potential
Uh,
tool for genocide in the future.
and when I started to put this together, you weren't a big PlayStation person, so I don't think you ever played Metal Gear Solid 2. Uh,
I
but
played. Was that the one? Was that the one for PS2?
there were
No.
two for PS2. There was 2 and
Was this the
3.
one like Sons of Liberty or something where they have the metal
Yes,
gate array?
yes.
Yeah, I remember that.
So the end point of that game was they talked about digital control and censorship and manipulation, and the idea of creating context through selective information and media control. And like this was 2001 when it came out, and we were stupid kids and just having a good time running around getting caught by guards and stealing dog tags. But this turned out to be such a prophetic way of looking at the world that I'm kind of floored in retrospect now to how effective it has become as a tool of warfare. Um, because arguably it has been effective. It gave Russia a foot in the door for Ukraine that allowed them to carry out this operation in the first place. Like,
One thing that astounded me to a degree is actually, in 2013, 2014, that Russia was not able to exploit divisions in Ukrainian society even more, because Ukrainian society, even historically, is a very divided society. You have, during the Kozak Hetmanates, fighting factions of, Cossacks following one hetman over another. Ukrainians are strong, and when they do decide to fight together, they can fight very, very well. But and this is actually one thing I do love about Ukrainians too, not just their ability to at one moment fight very cohesively, but I like their lack of cohesiveness too, because they're a very there's a saying in Ukrainian. It's where there are two Cossacks, so two Cossack warriors, there are three hetmans. So what this means is you know Ukrainians have extremely divergent points of view, and it's one reason why they've been trampled over that area, because it's sort of a, they call it diki pole, like the wild fields.
yeah, it's
um
pretty much a highway, really, when you get down to it for an army.
it is. And I love Ukraine, and like when I see some of these people, not a lot of, I think, Western analysts get a really good feel for Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian how they think, and especially a lot of people, like even some people within Ukrainian studies, the big hitters like Timothy Snyder, I don't think really knows how your average Ukrainian is. He the people he associates with are intellectuals. So, if you went to the places in Ukraine that I go, he'd be, I think, without a guide or something, he'd be kind of, or out locals being, worshiping him because he's an American, he'd be probably pretty scared shitless. But yeah, they don't really get a sense for how divergent Ukrainian, how opinionated of a people they are. And that's one aspect that makes me love them so much. And, because when you talk to someone, you get a completely different point of view. And that is one weakness within their society, but I also believe it's a great strength.
I don't necessarily
And
think it's a weakness at all.
yeah,
It's a weakness. So, we're getting way off topic, but it
we,
is
we are
a
getting off topic, but I will say one thing, just to close that. And Ukrainians, ultimately, what they care about is just to be able to live stably and to be able to feed themselves. That's like one major thing. Of course, they want a better country, but that the whole, anyway.
right.
Yeah, that's a whole different topic.
I got I Yes, diversity is not really a flaw unless it's exploited. But I have 6 of these to get through, and then we have to talk about the list because I want to make a point about this list. Number
Okay.
5 is organization. Genocides are always planned. Regimes of hatred often train those who go on to carry out the destruction of a people. Polarization. Propaganda begins to be spread by hate groups. This is also going to come up tomorrow. The Nazis used the newspaper Der Stürmer to spread an incite. I'm glad I can still do my German well. Spread and incite messages of hate about Jewish people. Preparation. Perpetrators plan the genocide. They often use euphemisms such as the Nazis' phrase, the final solution, to cloak their intentions. They create fear of the victim group, building up armies and weapons. Persecution. Victims are identified because of their ethnicity or religion, and death lists are drawn up. People are sometimes segregated into ghettos, deported, or starved, and property is often expropriated. Genocidal massacres begin. Extermination. The hate group murders their identified victims in a deliberate and systemic campaign of violence. Millions of lives have been destroyed or changed beyond recognition through genocide. And finally, number 10, denial. The perpetrators or later generations deny the existence of any crime. This list is presented as a flowchart. Here, I will send it to you so you can look.
I've actually read this list once before, and it's a very good.
There are a couple problems I have.
There are, yeah, but overall, I can tell that he did comparative research with it. He wasn't just
Yes.
using the Holocaust as the prime example, and that's a problem within genocide studies. Is the Holocaust sort of has this primacy with it, largely due to the fact that I think that the concept, I mean, it was developing in Lemkin's mind. You could see it developing before the Holocaust happened. He was already a scholar interested in, the topic of mass killing. But the Holocaust really was able to sort of, give some substance to this and provide him sort of a foundation to actually bring this concept to light, even though it had existed long prior. But my problem is that people approach, especially retroactively, like when I was talking about the Holodomor, they approach a lot of these things retroactively with that same framework, and each genocide is horrible, but they all have different characteristics. They all have
Yes.
different sort of one thing though that they do all have is denial. That is something that is present throughout all of them.
Well, to be frank, denial.
One thing I will say though is that debate over, for example, intent over when you're talking about mass killings, denial means that they don't happen, that they never happened, and that if they did, the number was minusculely low and there wasn't intent. But debate over whether or not something constitutes it, that's something that happens within scholarly circles. So you can't necessarily badmouth certain scholars if they say like if they disagree with the Christich decision, which we'll talk about, as Southwick, the scholar I recommend you, sort of outlines her argument. So that's the thing. Denial is a present feature, and in regard to the Christich decision has to do with the Srebrenica massacre. I'm just explaining to our viewers, and we're going to talk about Bosnia, the genocide of Bosnian Muslims that occurred there. And but essentially, that happened, in the course of this event. It still happens in Serbia, where people say that they didn't deliberately kill these people in that area, which is absolute BS.
They seem
sorry
awfully dead to me.
Friends, but it's BS.
At any rate, this is presented as kind of a flow chart. Like, here is each step along the road. And my assertion is that this is not a flow chart. It is a grab bag out of which you assemble it's like, this is kind of, yes, this 100%. Is kind of like the IKEA of genocide, some assembly required. And this gets into my...
Not all of those factors are present in every genocide. And sometimes genocides can occur quick. They're not always so well planned. Sometimes they're,
Yes, so not all 10 elements have to be present. You can kind of build your own adventure, so to speak, if you get my drift.
that's a very, very awkward way of describing that endeavor of the endeavor of genocide.
Caruso, why do you hate me, the one I
I
have
feel
bad
it's like,
empanada on?
you can create hell in, many different ways. There are many ways to assemble hell for a certain group of people. And yeah, no, I would agree with you 100%. Anything else?
Uh, Announcements, actually, yes, because we have
Perfect.
announcements because even though I'm the producer and should be fired, I'm still doing a lot of work. We
I
have
am going to do some work, I promise.
yes, we
This
have
is like the first episode where I've come to my own, where I'm not as, I'm a pretty camera shy person, to be honest. Even like, when I've done like academic presentations, I'm really like nervous. And, this is a topic that is sort of my wheelhouse. It's my bread and butter. So it's something that, I'm very comfortable talking about. It's actually probably one of the only things I'm very, very comfortable talking about. Not really, but yeah, I'm actually comfortable talking about it a lot,
so
especially like when I'm around Ukrainians. You can talk about whatever you want.
I definitely can't because I won't mention being part German. Anyway, anyway, to actually they might be a little bit far more favorably disposed now that they're delivering tanks. Anyway,
You know,
announcements.
yeah. Enough about the tanks,
So
but
we are up to three separate types of show that involve both of us that we are now doing because um, we are doing this regular history episode every month. We are doing Nerd Out Hour with two guys every month now, and we'll be doing Ukraine for the foreseeable future because that ain't ending anytime soon. And February is probably when a counteroffensive on one side or the other will kick off. So I will have a schedule that will probably be changed tentatively going forward.
we can't really control the events of the war. Unfortunately, if I could, I would make it completely done, and I'd have Ukrainian tanks in Moscow.
Uh,
Yeah.
the next thing is I took some time off after my surgery of actually doing anything productive here on stream. We will be kicking off for the end portion of this week with regular streams on topics again. There is a section in our Discord for stream content suggestions that you can send me so that I can decide what we might review on stream. I'll be
We
doing
are also we do need to do review videos, but we also need to do that match on Red Dragon. By the
yes,
way,
we will be doing more
I
gaming
think it's
history
probably
gaming
one of those
streams.
strategy games that I can kick your. Yeah.
Probably because I played exactly one game of it, so I have to play some practice games before we do that. The
Let's
other,
do you and I some practice games. We can before we stream it because it's
yes,
a lot different playing against the computer. The AI in Red Dragon is quite predictable. They kind of spoiler alert. The AI tends to follow like they tend to do what Russia did during the northern advance on the northern axis in Ukraine. So that is like go single file on a road,
I like
and
roads.
they don't use enough mass usually. So
Linear danger areas are fun. Anyway,
yeah,
the other thing that we are doing is I know you talked about a video essay you want to do, and which will be fun because I have the editing software. I have to put it together. I am working on part 2 of our political violence in America video essay series. I am having a couple extra books arrive too before I get into it, and that has turned out to be our second most viewed video so far as part 1, which tells me that it might be very lucrative for me to tear apart What If Halt content if I don't lose my mind first. And the other thing is, this is a special 2-part episode. Tomorrow night, we will continue the content with a discussion of everything on this document that we didn't get to tonight, because I knew
we're
this
going
was
to
going to run
actually
long.
be digging into genocide examples of genocide itself and I mean, obviously, this episode we spent more time, so we're going to spend more time on that one too. We will also get into areas, different genocidal events that don't quite meet that legal category, or at least some argue they don't. So yeah, that'll be our episode tomorrow. And one thing I think that we should do is put some of the links, maybe.
Yes, I
At
will
least
organize that.
articles that have links to both some of the books I mentioned, but also the articles I sent you. Some of the articles, I mean, you have to have academic access, I think, to get them, like JSTOR access, or some of them
I
can be
wonder if mine
downloaded
still
for
works
free.
right now. I'll have to see.
If it does, you got to give it to me because mine sure as hell doesn't.
Uh,
But
benefit of
academia.eu, by the way, people, is a really good way to get, if you're interested in history, it's a free website. You have to make a profile. A lot of people who are on it are academics, but you can, type in a topic, and downloading articles is essentially free for the people who put them up. It's a rather annoying website, but it's a good way to get articles. For those of you who can read Russian among our group, or Ukrainian, the greatest thing about Russian and Ukrainian internet is they have no concept of
paywalls.
yeah, you can download it's been so useful for me as a researcher because I've been able to find PDFs and Word docs of research, of some scholars I know, or just, people that I don't. The internet's free for taking. The Ukrainian internet is very much like the brief sort of territory control during the revolutionary civil war area, Nestor Makhno, the anarchist leader. So Ukrainian internet is very, you can find all the academic articles you want, and there's no paywall or anything. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's if you read those languages. It's very useful.
And so yeah, that pretty much wraps up tonight. It's been actually almost 2 hours at this point.
Perfect.
So we have Lucy. You are absolutely invited to come on tomorrow as a friend of the channel. We'd love to have you. I know it's kind of late in Poland right now, or early, as the case may be, because it's late here. So, and that's going to pretty much wrap up. You stay on because we need to talk about something real quick off stream.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out tonight, and I hope you all have an excellent evening/morning, depending on what part of the world you are